Title: The Chilling Mystery of Julia Martha. Thomas, one of Victorian England's most infamous crime script. Tonight we revisit one case that became part of British memory. One woman, one investigation, one verdict that entered the national record and has remained there. The case of Julia Martha Thomas begins in Richmond, Surrey, in the early months of 1879. Richmond, at that time, was a town of about 12,000 residents, situated on the south bank of the River Thames, where the river bends westward toward Twickenham. The town was prosperous by the standards of the time. Its character was mostly residential, and its population was made up mainly of professional and retired middle-class men and women of modest but comfortable means who valued Richmond's closeness to the capital while keeping their distance from its crowded inner districts. The South Western Railway provided a direct connection to London, and the streets near the river and Richmond Green were lined with Georgian and early Victorian cottages and terrace houses, well maintained and occupied in the respectable way expected in the neighbourhood. Richmond Park lay to the south, its large enclosed area of royal land giving the town a feeling of being close to the countryside and adding to its claim to gentility. Park Road, where this account begins, was a quiet residential street of modest cottages occupied by widows, retired people, and others of similar circumstances. Each cottage was equipped in the way standard for households of this class and time, including the large cast-iron boiling vessel fitted in the kitchen or outhouse and used for washing linen. Such a vessel was called a copper. Its presence at 2 Vine Cottages, Park Road, in the early months of 1879 was unremarkable. It would not remain so. Julia Martha Thomas was a middle-aged widow living alone at 2 Vine Cottages at the time of her death. She had lived in the cottage for some time before the events of March 1879 and was known in her neighbourhood as a woman of settled and predictable routine. She attended church every Sunday morning without exception, leaving the cottage at a regular hour and returning in the afternoon by the same route through the same quiet streets. She kept the house with the help of domestic servants, of whom she had hired and then lost several in the period before January 1879. None had stayed in her service for any long time. The exact details of her life before Richmond are not fully established in the surviving record. She was a widow, having taken the surname Thomas through marriage. Her late husband's given name is not confirmed in the sources available and is not named in this account. She had no known children. Her financial circumstances seem to have been modest but enough, sufficient to keep the cottage, employ a servant, and maintain the routine of a respectable widow of her standing. The exact source of her income was not examined in detail during the proceedings that followed her death. Those who knew her described her as a woman of firm opinions and demanding expectations in the home, likely to find fault with the conduct of those in her service. The pattern of servants dismissed or leaving from 2 Vine Cottages before the events of this account matches these contemporary descriptions. At the start of 1879, Julia Thomas was living alone without domestic help, and she had placed an advertisement for a new servant. She was a woman in her 50s. She was regular in her habits and known in her community. The record of Julia Thomas's life before the hiring of January 1879 is limited in its surviving detail. She was a widow of settled circumstance. She was known in her neighbourhood and at her church. She had hired a new domestic servant as the year began, completing a series of arrangements that had not previously produced a stable household. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. The woman hired as domestic servant at 2 Vine Cottages in January 1879 was Catherine Webster, known as Kate Webster. Webster had been born in County Wexford, Ireland, around the year 1849, though sources differ on the exact year. She had moved to England at some point in her younger years, likely in her late teens or early 20s, and had established herself in the working-class districts of South and West London in the years that followed. By the time she was hired by Julia Thomas, Webster had built up a criminal record of considerable length. She had been convicted of theft several times and had served more than one prison term in England, including at least one sentence at Wandsworth Prison in Surrey. The exact convictions and their dates require verification against the criminal records of the period. The general pattern, however, is well established. Webster had moved between jobs and places in the years before 1879, supporting herself through petty theft and domestic work gained without telling employers about her past. She had an illegitimate son. The child was being cared for by associates elsewhere at the time of her employment with Julia Thomas and did not live at Vine Cottages during the period in question. Webster had worked in a series of domestic jobs across South and West London before coming to Richmond. She had left each earlier position under circumstances linked to suspicion or clear evidence of dishonesty. She was described by those who knew her as physically strong and capable of great physical effort. She had enough presence and self-control to present herself, when needed, as a capable and reliable domestic servant. She had a network of acquaintances in the working-class community through which she moved, gained through years of residence in the same general area of outer South London. Among these acquaintances was a man named John Church, a publican who kept a house in the area of Hammersmith. Webster knew Church and others in the area through the connections of shared neighbourhood and social circumstance. The exact nature of Webster's relationship with Church at the time of her employment with Julia Thomas was not described in detail in the evidence given at the later proceedings, but his name would appear again throughout the investigation and trial that followed. Webster presented herself for the position at 2 Vine Cottages. Her past was not disclosed. She was hired. She took up residence in the cottage in January 1879. The earlier circumstances that brought Kate Webster to the door of 2 Vine Cottages formed a pattern familiar to those who would later rebuild it. A woman with a past she could not reveal, moving from one short-term position to another, each ending in departure or dismissal, arriving at each new place under conditions that made discovery unlikely until some later point. That this particular employment would end as it did was not clear at the time of her arrival in Richmond. The cottage held 2 women, employer and servant, in what looked in every way like the ordinary domestic arrangement it was meant to be. The relationship between Julia Thomas and Kate Webster grew worse with great speed after Webster's arrival in the household. Thomas kept exact requirements for the management of her home, and her tolerance for mistakes was, by the consistent account of those who had known her in earlier employment arrangements, limited. Webster had neither the training nor the temperament to meet these requirements with steady reliability. She had obtained the position without revealing the record that would have made her unsuitable in the eyes of any employer with Thomas's expectations. The friction that developed between the 2 women was not unusual in its general kind. Arguments between mistresses and servants over the carrying out of household duties were common in this period and rarely came to formal notice. What made this particular friction different was how quickly it grew worse and how it ended. Within weeks of Webster's arrival at Vine Cottages, Thomas decided to end the arrangement. She gave Webster notice in the final days of February 1879. The exact date has not been confirmed in the available record. The notice seems to have been given some days before the 2nd of March. The employment was over. Webster was dismissed. For Webster, being given notice brought consequences that went beyond losing a job. It took away her lodging, her daily meals, and her wages at a time when she had few alternatives and no disclosed history that would help her get a new position. Her criminal record, if it became known, would close most respectable domestic positions to her. She had a child to support, however indirectly, through whatever arrangements were in place for his care. The position at Vine Cottages, modest and difficult as it had proved, had represented a settled situation that could not easily be replaced. In the days that remained of the notice period, Webster continued to live at the cottage, carrying out whatever remaining duties were required of her. She and Thomas occupied the same small rooms, the same domestic spaces, in the closeness that a cottage of this size forced on those who shared it. There were no other residents. There were no witnesses to whatever words passed between them during those final days. On the morning of Sunday, the 2nd of March, 1879, Julia Thomas left Vine Cottages at her usual hour and attended the church she had attended each week without interruption. She was seen by members of the congregation who knew her. She was seen returning to the cottage in the afternoon. The afternoon moved into evening. She did not come out of the house again. The circumstances, as they stood on the evening of the 2nd of March 1879, were these. A dismissed servant in the final days of her notice, without settled prospects, living in the same small cottage as the woman who had dismissed her. The neighbourhood continued its Sunday. Nothing from the outside of Two Vine Cottages showed what was happening inside that evening, and nothing would show it for some days to come. What happened inside Two Vine Cottages on the evening of the 2nd of March 1879 was established through the evidence presented at the later trial and through the testimony of those witnesses who could speak to what they had seen just before and after that evening. The sequence, as rebuilt through the proceedings, was as follows. Julia Thomas returned to the cottage on the afternoon of Sunday, the 2nd of March, after attending church, as had been her regular practice. That evening, an altercation took place between Thomas and Webster inside the cottage. The exact circumstances in which the altercation began are not recorded with certainty in the available record. What the medical evidence established at the later trial was that Julia Thomas was attacked and strangled. She died inside the cottage at Two Vine Cottages, Park Road, Richmond, during the evening of the 2nd of March 1879. She was a woman in her 50s, in her own home, at the hands of the servant she had dismissed. In the days that followed the murder, Kate Webster carried out a long series of actions meant to hide what she had done. The body of Julia Thomas was dismembered inside the cottage over the course of the days following the 2nd of March. The domestic copper, the large cast-iron laundry vessel fitted in the kitchen at Vine Cottages, was used in the process. Portions of the remains were exposed to heat. This was established in evidence at the later trial and was reported widely in the press at the time. At some point during the days after the murder, Webster offered a quantity of rendered fat to a neighbour, describing it as the best dripping. The neighbour refused. This incident was given in testimony at both the inquest and the trial, and entered the permanent record of the case. Webster packed the dismembered remains into a wooden box. She needed help to move the box from the cottage, and for this purpose she enlisted a man named Henry Porter, an acquaintance. Porter helped carry the box from the premises. The box was taken to the area of the River Thames at Barnes and left there. The head was not placed in the box. It was disposed of separately by means that the investigation of 1879 did not establish with certainty and at a place that the proceedings of that year did not identify. The head was not recovered in 1879. Having disposed of or hidden the remains, Webster stayed at Two Vine Cottages. She lived in the house in the days after the murder as though she were its lawful resident. She dressed herself in Julia Thomas's clothing. She wore Thomas's jewellery. In the days right after the murder, she began selling Thomas's furniture and personal belongings, using John Church, the publican she knew in Hammersmith, in the disposal of the household contents. Church later maintained that he had no knowledge of the circumstances surrounding the furniture's availability, and was ultimately acquitted of any involvement in the crime. Webster presented herself to various tradespeople and acquaintances in Richmond as the occupant of the cottage, taking on, as far as the situation allowed, the place and appearance of the woman whose home she was living in. She moved through Thomas's house, wearing Thomas's clothes, giving away Thomas's possessions, behaving as the mistress of the household. The actions taken by Kate Webster in the days after the 2nd of March made up a prolonged effort to hide the murder and turn the victim's property to her own use. The record of these days, rebuilt through witness testimony at the later trial, forms one of the most detailed parts of the evidence in this case. The record received it in full. The discovery of what remained of Julia Thomas came by two separate paths, and neither was at first connected to the other. On or about the 5th of March 1879, a wooden box was recovered in the area of Barnes on or near the northern bank of the River Thames. Barnes at that time was a working riverside district, a stretch of bank open to those who used the Thames for commercial and domestic purposes, situated some distance from the busier parts of the central London waterfront, but not far from the routines of those whose work brought them to the river. The box was found and reported to the proper authorities. The remains inside it were identified as those of a human adult female, dismembered and in a condition showing the passage of several days and the use of heat on parts of the material. the discovery was received by officers of the relevant constabulary, and a coroner was notified. The identity of the woman whose remains had been placed in the box and left at Barnes was not, at the time of discovery, established. The investigation into the Barnes find was opened as a question, without an immediate answer. The second direction from which suspicion grew came from Julia Thomas's own neighbourhood, and from the church she had attended without interruption throughout her residence in Richmond. Thomas was a woman of fixed and public routine. Her absence from church on the Sunday after the 2nd of March was noticed by members of the congregation who had known her. She did not appear in her street in the days that followed. She did not answer any inquiry. Neighbours who had occasion to observe the comings and goings at 2 Vine Cottages noticed the presence of Kate Webster in the house and the absence of Julia Thomas with growing unease. They noticed that furniture was being removed from the cottage and that Webster was acting as though the premises were her own. The combination of Thomas's unexplained absence and Webster's unusual behaviour began in the days right after the murder to draw exactly the kind of attention that Webster's continued presence in Richmond could not survive. The 2 lines of inquiry, the unidentified remains recovered at Barnes and the missing woman of Park Road, Richmond, were brought together through the build-up of circumstantial evidence gathered from both directions and the use of the investigative resources available to the Surrey Constabulary and the Metropolitan Police in the weeks that followed. The investigation was formally opened. Officers were sent to the relevant addresses and to the places linked with the disposal of the remains and the sale of Thomas's property. Statements were taken from those who had had any dealings with Julia Thomas or with Kate Webster in the period around the events of March 1879. Neighbours in Park Road were interviewed about what they had seen in the days after the 2nd of March. Members of Thomas's church gave accounts of her final attendance and of her unexplained absence afterward. Individuals who had purchased items from Webster in the days after the murder were identified through inquiry and their accounts recorded. Tradespeople who had been approached by Webster in connection with the sale of household contents were sought out and their testimonies taken. The process of identifying and finding witnesses moved through the network of acquaintances, neighbours, and commercial contacts that the ordinary domestic life of a woman in Thomas's position had created. John Church, the Hammersmith publican, came to the attention of the investigating officers during these inquiries. He was questioned about his involvement in the disposal of furniture from Vine Cottages, and gave a statement saying that he had acted in good faith without knowledge of the circumstances surrounding the furniture's availability. He was later arrested on suspicion of being involved in the murder. The question of Church's knowledge and involvement became a major part of the later legal proceedings, and Webster would try to make considerable use of it in her own defence. Henry Porter, who had helped Webster carry the wooden box to Barnes, was identified and interviewed. His testimony established a direct evidentiary connection between the box recovered at Barnes and the cottage at Vine Cottages, and gave an account of Webster's role in moving the remains to the river. Porter said that he had carried the box without knowing what was inside it. The evidence produced at the later proceedings did not establish that Porter had known what the box contained, and no charge was brought against him in connection with the murder. His account of the events surrounding the transport of the box was still a critical part of the prosecution's case, establishing the chain from the premises at Park Road to the riverbank at Barnes. Before the full force of the investigation could close in on her, Webster left Richmond. She made her way to Ireland, returning to the country of her birth and the county of Wexford. A warrant for her arrest was issued. She was found in Ireland and arrested. She was returned to England to face the proceedings against her. After her return, and during the formal proceedings that followed, Webster denied the murder. She tried to direct the investigation and later the jury toward John Church, claiming that Church had been responsible for the killing and that she had been forced or deceived into helping hide it. This account was put forward as her main line of defense and would be presented again at her trial. By the time Webster was brought back to face proceedings, the investigation had gathered a body of circumstantial evidence of considerable size and coherence. The remains recovered from the Thames at Barnes had been medically examined. Thomas's personal property, including clothing, jewellery, and household furniture, had been found in Webster's possession, or traced to transactions Webster had carried out in the days after the murder. multiple witnesses had placed Webster in Thomas's cottage, wearing Thomas's clothing and presenting herself as the occupant of the household. The chain of evidence connecting Webster to the death of Julia Thomas, the disposal of the remains, the impersonation of the victim, and the dishonest conversion of the victim's property was extensive and based on the testimony of a large number of witnesses. The investigation had identified a perpetrator, secured her return to face English justice, and assembled a case based on physical evidence, witness testimony, and the recorded trail left by Webster's own actions in the days after the murder. The case was prepared for submission to the formal legal process. A post-mortem examination of the remains recovered from the Thames at Barnes was carried out by medical witnesses, whose findings were entered into the official record and later presented in evidence at the trial. The remains, as received by the examining surgeons, consisted of dismembered parts of a human body. They were identified as the remains of an adult female. The condition of the remains showed the use of heat on parts of the material, consistent with the boiling process described by witnesses who had seen or been approached by Webster in the days after the murder. The examining surgeons gave evidence about the cause of death as far as they were able to determine it from the physical evidence available. The cause of death was established as strangulation. This conclusion was reached on the basis of the physical evidence shown by the remains, together with the surrounding circumstantial evidence as to the way in which the death had occurred. The finding of strangulation was consistent with the account of events as rebuilt through witness testimony and as later admitted by Webster herself in her final confession. The examination of the remains was carried out with the limits necessarily imposed by the condition in which they were received. The process of dismemberment and the partial use of heat had greatly changed the physical evidence available to the examining surgeons. The identification of the remains as those of Julia Thomas rested first on the conclusion that they were those of an adult female. Matching in physical characteristics Thomas's age and size, combined with the circumstantial evidence connecting the box in which they were found to the cottage at Vine Cottages. The exact identity of the deceased could not be established from the physical evidence of the remains alone, because the condition of those remains prevented the usual means by which such identification might have been made. The identification was therefore achieved by the joining together of physical evidence and the large body of circumstantial evidence drawn from the investigation. The head of the deceased was absent. It had been disposed of separately from the rest of the remains and was not available for examination. The post-mortem findings established the fact of violent death, confirmed the cause as strangulation, and provided the medical basis on which the prosecution would present its case. These findings were entered into the official record and formed part of the evidence placed before the coroner's inquest and, later, before the jury at the Old Bailey. The medical record of this case was incomplete in the most literal sense. The remains were partial, the identification was inferential in part, and the head of the deceased was absent from the examination. The medical evidence established what it could establish given the material available to it. The findings were enough to support the formal proceedings that followed. An inquest was convened after the completion of the post-mortem examination and the gathering of the preliminary evidence by the investigating officers. The proceedings were held before the presiding coroner for the relevant district. Testimony was received under oath from a series of witnesses whose evidence concerned the identity of the deceased, the circumstances of her death, and the actions of Kate Webster in the period after the 2nd of March 1879. The witnesses called before the inquest included those who had known Julia Thomas in her Richmond neighbourhood and at her church. They gave testimony about the regularity of her habits and the last times on which she had been seen alive. They described the circumstances in which Thomas's absence had come to their attention and the observations they had made about Kate Webster's presence in and around the cottage during the days that followed the murder. Witnesses who had been approached by Webster in connection with the sale of Thomas's furniture and personal belongings gave their accounts of those transactions. Henry Porter gave testimony about the transport of the wooden box to Barnes. Those who had seen Webster wearing Thomas's clothing and presenting herself as the occupant of the household gave their accounts. Medical witnesses testified about the findings of the post-mortem examination, presenting to the inquest the conclusions about cause of death and the physical characteristics of the remains recovered at Barnes. The evidence connecting the Barnes remains to the cottage at Vine Cottages and to the person of Julia Thomas was laid before the inquest in full. The jury considered the evidence as presented and returned its finding. The deceased was Julia Martha Thomas. The death was willful murder. Kate Webster was responsible for that murder. The coroner's jury returned these findings, and Webster was committed to stand trial at the Central Criminal Court in London. The inquest had received the evidence, assessed it, and produced the result that the investigation's findings warranted. The formal legal process was now to begin. The trial of Kate Webster on the charge of the willful murder of Julia Martha Thomas began at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, London, in July 1879. The exact opening date of the proceedings requires verification against the court records, but the trial was held in the middle part of that month and ended within a fairly short period by the standards of major criminal trials of the era. The Old Bailey at this time was the main criminal court of England and Wales, situated in the City of London, and it was to this court that the most serious criminal matters arising within its jurisdiction were sent for trial. The courtroom in which Webster was tried was, by contemporary accounts, crowded. The case had drawn great public and press interest from the moment the remains were discovered at Barnes, and that interest had not lessened in the months between the discovery and the start of the trial. The presiding judge was Mr. Justice Hawkins, one of the most prominent members of the judiciary of the late Victorian period, known for the precision of his handling of complex criminal trials. His conduct of proceedings in major cases during this era was closely watched by the press and the legal profession alike. The prosecution presented its case through the evidence of a series of witnesses whose testimony, taken in order, was aimed at establishing the complete chain of events from the final days of Julia Thomas's life to the flight of Kate Webster to Ireland. The evidence began with the establishment of Julia Thomas as a woman of settled routine and fixed local presence, known to her neighbours, known at her church, and known to have hired Kate Webster as her domestic servant in January 1879. The change in that routine, Thomas's sudden and unexplained absence from church, from her street, and from the ordinary business of her daily life, from the 3rd of March, 1879 onward, was documented through the testimony of those who had known her. Witnesses testified to what they had seen of Webster at Vine Cottages in the days after the murder. They described seeing Webster dressed in clothing identified as belonging to Julia Thomas. They described the sale of furniture, the removal of household contents, and Webster's behaviour as though the cottage were her own. Those who had been approached by Webster in connection with the sale of Thomas's property testified to the transactions they had carried out and identified the items involved as belonging to the deceased. John Church gave testimony about his own involvement in the disposal of the furniture and his dealings with Webster during this period. Henry Porter's testimony established for the jury the chain of events by which the wooden box containing the remains had been carried from the cottage at Vine Cottages to the riverside at Barnes. Porter described the circumstances in which he had helped Webster with the box. His testimony placed Webster at the centre of the disposal and provided the direct evidentiary link between the premises in Richmond and the remains discovered at Barnes. Medical witnesses testified about the post-mortem findings, establishing the cause of death as strangulation and confirming the physical characteristics of the remains as consistent with those of an adult female of Julia Thomas's approximate age. They addressed under examination the effects of the dismemberment and the use of heat on parts of the remains, and they gave their professional opinion about the manner in which death had occurred. The evidence of Webster's flight to Ireland was placed before the jury as a part of the prosecution's case, bearing on the consciousness of guilt that departure immediately upon discovery might reasonably suggest. The warrant that had been issued and the circumstances of Webster's return to face proceedings in England were documented. The prosecution's case, as presented to the jury, rested on the joining together of several separate lines of evidence rather than on any single decisive proof. There was no eyewitness to the murder itself. The identification of the remains as those of Julia Thomas was inferential in part. The case was circumstantial in its structure, but comprehensive in its extent. The number of witnesses, The consistency of their individual accounts and the coherence of the chain they together described were presented as the foundation on which the jury was invited to reach its conclusion. The defense presented on Webster's behalf relied mainly on the claim that John Church had committed the murder and that Webster had been forced or deceived into hiding it. This argument required the jury to accept that Church, who had been tried separately and acquitted, had in fact been the perpetrator. It required the jury to ignore or greatly discount the testimony of the many witnesses whose accounts placed Webster at the center of the disposal, the impersonation, and the dishonest conversion of Thomas's property. The defense also challenged the identification of the Barnes remains as those of Julia Thomas, directing the jury's attention to the absence of the head and the inferential nature of the identification. Neither argument succeeded in displacing the substance of what the prosecution had placed before the jury. Webster kept up her denial throughout the proceedings. She did not confess at trial. The account she gave, directing responsibility toward John Church, was the account she maintained in the courtroom. The jury heard the full evidence on both sides and retired to deliberate. The jury returned its verdict. Kate Webster was found guilty of the willful murder of Julia Martha Thomas. The verdict was entered in the record of the Central Criminal Court. The prosecution's case had been accepted. The jury had rejected the defense's arguments in full. The finding of guilty stood. The court then moved to the matter of sentence. Mr. Justice Hawkins addressed the court and the convicted woman after the return of the verdict. His remarks, as reported in press accounts of the proceedings, spoke to the character of the crime as it had been established in evidence. He observed that the murder of Julia Thomas had been followed by a sustained and deliberate effort to destroy the evidence of it, to hide the identity of the victim, to dispose of the remains by means meant to prevent discovery, and to take over the place and property of the woman who had been killed. He pronounced the sentence of death. Kate Webster was to be kept in custody until the date appointed for her execution, at which time the sentence was to be carried out within the walls of the prison as required under the law governing the conduct of executions since the passage of the Capital Punishment Amendment Act of 1868. The sentence was received without visible disturbance in the courtroom. Webster was removed from the dock. The proceedings at the Central Criminal Court were over. The press in attendance recorded the sentence and the circumstances of its delivery, and their accounts appeared in the editions of the major London and national papers within hours and days of the trial's end. The Times gave the proceedings detailed coverage. The Richmond and Twickenham Times, for which the case was a matter of immediate local importance, reported the verdict and sentence at length. The penny press and the broadside trade produced accounts aimed at a readership for whom the combination of murder, dismemberment, impersonation, and the condemned female servant represented the full measure of what such publications existed to convey. Public feeling, as shown in the press coverage of the time, did not show any major movement in favor of mercy. No substantial petition for the reprieve of Kate Webster was created in the weeks between the verdict and the execution. The case had not produced the kind of disputed facts or doubtful identification that might have led to organized action against the sentence. The conviction rested on extensive and coherent evidence. Webster's own conduct in the days after the murder, the evidence of impersonation and fraud, and the prolonged efforts to dispose of the remains had all been established through witnesses whose accounts the jury had accepted. Sir Richard Cross, who held the office of Home Secretary at the time, received no compelling grounds for the use of the prerogative of mercy. No reprieve was granted. Kate Webster remained at Wandsworth Prison in the weeks after the verdict, held under the conditions that applied to convicted prisoners awaiting execution. The date of the execution was set for the 29th of July, 1879. The sentence was pronounced. The date was set. The interval between verdict and execution passed in the way standard for the period. On the morning of the 29th of July, 1879, Kate Webster made a confession to the prison chaplain at Wandsworth. The fact of this confession is well established in the contemporary record, including the accounts carried in the press in the days right after the execution. The content of the confession, as reported through the chaplain's later account, included a statement by Webster that she had murdered Julia Thomas. It also included a statement about the position of John Church. Webster stated in the confession she made that morning that John Church bore no responsibility for the crime. She had at trial advanced his guilt as the basis of her defense. In the hours before her execution, she withdrew that account. Church's acquittal had already been entered in the court record, but the confession provided, in the form of the perpetrator's own dying statement, a confirmation of what the trial's outcome had effectively established. The record received the confession. The execution went forward. William Marwood carried out the execution. Marwood had succeeded William Calcraft as the official executioner of England in 1874 and had carried out most executions of the period. His method, which used a calculated drop designed to produce instant death rather than the slow strangulation connected with earlier practice, was regarded at the time as a more humane use of the death sentence. The execution was carried out within the walls of Wandsworth Prison, as the 1868 legislation required, before the prison governor, the chaplain, a medical officer, and the small number of official witnesses the law prescribed. There was no public attendance. The crowds that had gathered outside prisons at public executions in the decades before 1868 were not present at Wandsworth on the 29th of July, 1879. The execution was carried out, witnessed by the appointed officials, and recorded in the prison register. Webster's manner in her final hours was described in press accounts as composed. The press relied on the accounts given by prison officials and the chaplain, and such accounts of condemned prisoners in their final hours are not always reliable in every detail. What the record establishes is that she made her confession, received the ministrations of the chaplain, and was executed at the appointed time on the 29th of July, 1879. She was buried within the grounds of Wandsworth Prison, as was the standard practice for executed prisoners of the period. No external burial was arranged. The record of her interment was entered in the prison register. The execution of Kate Webster on the 29th of July, 1879, brought the formal legal proceedings of this case to their conclusion. The murder had been committed on the 2nd of March. The trial had ended in July. The execution followed within days of the sentence. From the discovery of the remains at Barnes to the closing of the prison register at Wandsworth, the case had passed through every stage of the Victorian criminal process in less than 5 months. The record was complete in its formal dimensions. The question of the missing head remained unanswered. It would remain so for 131 years. The case of Julia Martha Thomas and the trial and execution of Kate Webster entered the contemporary record through the widest channels available to the late Victorian press. The Times had followed the case from the first discovery of the remains at Barnes through the execution at Wandsworth, producing detailed accounts at each important stage. The Richmond and Twickenham Times covered it as the most important local case of its generation. The penny press issued accounts for a popular readership, and the broadsides that had long been the standard way of sharing the details of notable crimes and executions with those beyond the reach of the daily papers were produced in connection with the case at its end. In the decades after the trial, the case was included in collections of notable British trials and criminal histories that formed the standard reference literature of Victorian and Edwardian true crime. It was among the cases chosen for treatment in the true crime anthologies that grew through the late 19th and early 20th centuries as a recognized genre of popular history. Historians of Victorian crime, domestic service, and women and the law in the 19th century returned to it as a case that showed, within the bounds of a single criminal event, several of the period's most important social anxieties. The vulnerability of the solitary middle-class woman dependent on hired domestic help, the dangers connected with a servant class whose members could hide their histories, and the ability of the criminal process to pursue, identify, and prosecute even without a complete set of remains. The case remained a fixed part of British true crime literature throughout the 20th century. It appeared in collections devoted to Victorian murder, in studies of female perpetrators of violent crime, and in historical treatments of the position of the Victorian domestic servant. Its combination of elements, the murder in a respectable Surrey cottage, the disposal of the remains in a domestic copper, the impersonation of the victim, the flight to Ireland, the confession on the morning of execution, gave it a density of incident that kept it present in the literature of the period, long after cases of similar contemporary notoriety had faded from repeated treatment. In October 2010, during construction work carried out in the garden of a residential property in Mayfield Road, Richmond, a human skull was unearthed. The property had formerly been the home of Sir David Attenborough, the broadcaster and naturalist. Mayfield Road stands near Park Road, in the area where Vine Cottages had once been situated. The skull was submitted for forensic examination. The assessment was carried out by specialists at the Museum of London, including Professor Caroline Wilkinson. Forensic analysis determined that the skull belonged to a woman about 50 to 60 years old at the time of death, consistent with Julia Thomas's age in 1879. The skull was assessed as being about 130 years old, consistent with a date of death in the 1870s. The forensic conclusion reached was that the skull was almost certainly that of Julia Thomas, though the assessment stopped short of absolute certainty since the condition and the available comparison material did not allow the kind of identification that would meet the highest forensic standard. Sir David Attenborough, when informed of the discovery, publicly remarked on the extraordinary fact that the skull of the murdered woman had lain in the garden for 130 years. The assessment was widely reported. The skull was the missing element of the case, the head that had been disposed of separately in March 1879 and had not been found during the 1879 investigation. It had not been in the Thames. It had been in a Richmond garden, a short distance from where the murder had been committed, for the full length of the century and more that followed. The case of Julia Martha Thomas is regarded by historians of Victorian crime as one of the defining criminal cases of the 1870s and as one of the most fully documented cases of a female perpetrator in the Victorian era. It is important in the history of forensic investigation as a case in which the perpetrator's efforts to destroy the physical evidence of the crime by dismemberment and the use of heat were ultimately not enough to prevent identification and conviction, showing the extent to which the joining together of circumstantial evidence could stand in for the direct physical evidence that the destruction of the body had been meant to remove. The impersonation sequence that followed the murder, Webster's days in the cottage wearing Thomas's clothing and selling Thomas's possessions, held a special place in the public memory of the case. It represented a level of calculated conduct beyond the murder itself that impressed observers at the time, and has continued to set the case apart in historical treatment. The sustained effort to take on the identity of the victim, to become, in the domestic and commercial spaces of Richmond, the woman who had been killed, added to the case a quality that the press and the public found hard to put aside. The case also held a particular place in the social history of the late Victorian period. The relationship between Julia Thomas and Kate Webster was the relationship between employer and servant, between a woman of modest, middle-class respectability and a woman of working-class Irish immigrant background with a history of imprisonment. The press treatment of the case in 1879 drew heavily on existing anxieties about Irish domestic servants and the risks linked with hiring servants whose backgrounds could not be verified. Webster's Irish origins were mentioned in press coverage in terms that reflected the nativist assumptions of the period rather than the impartial language of forensic record. These aspects of the case's contemporary reception are part of its historical record, though they belong to the history of the press and public discussion of the period rather than to the evidence that determined its outcome. The conviction rested on evidence. The evidence was sufficient. The verdict was correct. The later confession confirmed what the jury had established through the proceedings at the Old Bailey. The case, as a legal matter, was concluded on the 29th of July, 1879, with the execution at Wandsworth. The case, as a historical matter, has not concluded. The discovery in 2010 returned it to public attention and showed that the physical evidence of the crime had lasted longer than the investigation that sought it, the trial that prosecuted it, and the century and more that separated the murder from the spade that turned the Richmond garden. The record had been incomplete in one specific and important respect since March 1879. The 2010 discovery did not formally close that gap, since the forensic identification stopped short of absolute certainty, but it addressed it as far as the available evidence allowed. The case of Julia Martha Thomas was the single matter examined in this account. The conviction was entered. The execution was carried out in 1879. The case became part of the national record. It has not left.